wide-site TV.
Isabel, you were brought in to provide greater focus on the commercial and strategic side of things. Tell me a bit about that brief and how it's going 18 months on.
Yeah, thank you so much, Nova, and thank you so much for having me here and for asking such a good question of me. It's going well, is the best way I can put it. When I joined Renewable UK, the association had gone through a period of quite difficult financial circumstances. It had been losing money for quite a number of years. Primarily, I think, because there wasn't really a commercial mindset to the revenue stream. So the association did a lot, but not necessarily thinking about generating additional revenues and generating surplus to keep investing. So previous CEO Hugh McNeil was amazing at establishing RenewableUK as a super credible trade association. I was so pleased when I joined, because having been at other associations and trade bodies that struggle to get government credibility, struggle to have the right dialogues, and to reach the fine balance between diplomacy and advocacy. I just realized that Renewable UK had the year of government, had the year Whitehall and Westminster. It just wasn't making enough money to grow, basically. So the stance that I took was to work with the members and the board to really understand where we could generate more value, and understand what they are prepared to pay for from a trade body, as opposed to go to a consultancy or go to a commercial events provider where they're investing their money in terms of their visibility, their network, their business development, as well as their advocacy efforts, because the sector can do a lot together through Renewable UK rather than through their own advocacies. Government doesn't want to talk to 20, 30 members. Government wants to talk to fewer stakeholders. So there was definitely something very valuable that we could provide, and that companies would be prepared to pay for. So the first year was tricky because we had COVID and we had a massive hole in our budget because of the events income. We suddenly were faced with a potential loss of £500,000, if no more, on an association that basically had been either losing money or breaking even for many years. So reserves were already kind of getting to a low point. I was incredibly grateful to the board in April last year for allowing me an investment. They gave me just over 6 figures to invest on virtual events without any guarantee that it was going to work, other than our gut instinct and our conversations with the sector. And that's what we did last year. So we kept working on growing the membership. The sector wasn't as affected by COVID, and from the perspective of, it remained working. The critical infrastructure the criteria were met. So the sector continued working, people kept working, and we were able to deliver virtual events. And like I said, I'm incredibly grateful to the senior team, to the then CEO and the board for allowing us to have that investment. So we ended up the year actually losing 290,000 instead of $500,000, which was great. And that puts us in good stead to start this year with a strong performance in 2020, having delivered value to the members. Now, as you all know, as the sector knows, the CEO resigned then. So he decided to leave us last year, and the new CEO was appointed just before Christmas. It was announced in January, but we knew who he was. So the commercial strategy that I was originally hired to deliver was delayed a little bit because of COVID and because of the change in CEOs. So the beginning of the year was very much preparing for that strategy, doing a lot of work, understanding the size of the market, understanding the size of what the membership's budgets could accommodate in terms of spending money with us. We grew the membership this year by almost 20%. We went from 370 companies to 463 companies. That's a huge amount. For any membership body, it's a huge amount. We've had traditionally attrition of 12, 13%. This year we're sitting at 7% attrition, which is significantly better. And we did set out a budget at the beginning of the year to lose 340,000. We were prepared to lose that amount of money again, considering the ongoing crisis. We're actually going to end up in the black with the highest level of profit in history, basically, in the past 10 years of the organization. And this is all, like I said, I don't want to make it sound like this is just because of something I did or my department did. This is the members trusting the association, trusting that we've been so successful with government and we've been so successful in opening the market, really, really refreshing the market design, that they feel that Renewable UK is a trade body where they want to invest more, as well as across the wider portfolio. So the best way I can say is going well. We have a new strategy, a new commercial strategy that we presented to the board a couple of weeks ago, no, a month ago. We have a new CEO. I always say that because it makes me laugh, because I feel like I'm getting old. This is the first CEO I've ever reported to that is a year younger than me, and he's just like a dynamo, he's just like, I always feel like I have the foot in the accelerator and I'm going at a million miles an hour. He goes faster than I do. So it's great because he has a mandate from the board to have a new ambitious strategy. And the commercial strategy is part of that, as a strategy that enables the rest of the work that we have to do, the core work that we have to do. So from my perspective, it's going well, and things are rosy for the sector. And I think the dialogues at COP now, the additional investment that is coming in is just demonstrating that.
Fantastic. Things certainly do seem to be rosy. That's a really lovely, positive story. And you just mentioned the core work. Let's talk about that. So diplomacy and advocacy, you mentioned a few minutes ago, and I'm imagining that's pretty much the core work. And I know you've said in the past that RUK has a duty to hold the government to account and to hold the public, the sector to account. Tell me a bit more about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's really important. I mean, the core work of any trade body, to some extent, is the policy and advocacy. I like to say that the business development and networking, the facilitation of business growth that my department does is also core. So I'll make that point. And in all these three areas, we need to hold both government but also the sector into account. So it's not straightforward, because government has been very supportive of the sector in many different ways, but government expects certain things. So, for example, through offshore wind sector deal, there are expectations that the sector will do a number of things, in terms of supporting the recruitment of local content and investing on people in skills and investing on various areas of the development of the sector and of green energy as something that ticks the boxes of local community engagement and public engagement, everything from environmental concerns and consents to visual concerns and consents, and how do we bring the people along. And I think the government is right to expect that we do that better. And Renewable UK has a right and a duty to do that with the members. So we don't just, in this way, we don't just listen to the members and do necessarily what their directions of travel lead them to do as companies. We have to go back and sense check and say, well, excuse me, are you doing this? Is this actually being done? Because otherwise we'll be less credible with government when it comes to the next stages of development. And there are some areas where we really feel that the sector is doing extremely well and is doing great work, but needs to do better. Some areas like local content are clear. And again, this is not an easy one. It's not something that we can just fix. The local content isn't there. The supply chain is not necessarily here. Brexit creates additional challenges, but we need to make sure that we don't just use these as convenient excuses for things that are not happening. We need to work with the sector to understand what is needed and then clarify to government where we need that additional support. So it's interesting, for example, that in onshore, our local content targets that don't exist are actually easier to meet. We have over 72% local content in onshore, but for offshore, we are far from those targets, and government is right to expect us to meet them. People, skills, diversity. The sector has an internal target to improve diversity, both gender diversity and BAME diversity. We need to do better. At Global Offshore Wind, for example, we used to have a target of 33% female speakers for that program. A new CEO came in and said, "Oh, put 40. Just raise the target." We ended up with 50. We ended up with 50% female speakers, and you can find that, and this was a bit anecdotal, but it's there. For the opening panel of business leaders, we had no women. We had Emma Howard obviously come there and challenge us on that, and so we need to do better. So there are things. Very often I find I'm the only woman in a session, or I've been invited perhaps because I'm a woman, and I don't like that. I'll be honest with you, I don't like that. I don't like to feel that it's my gender that has led to an invitation. I also don't like to feel that opportunities are not open to me because everybody else is so senior, and as a result, RUK needs to send someone so senior, and that so senior person is often a man, because the C-suite is often a man, and that's how it is. Both of those things bother me, and I'm being candid about them. That's us holding the sector to account, but we also hold government to account constantly. I mean, one good example perhaps is hydrogen. I mean, the government has published, BASE has published its hydrogen strategy, and we work very closely with BASE. We've informed BASE, but we are pushing the boundaries there. We're saying this is not quite good enough. This needs to be improved. We'll be missing opportunities if we don't change that. But we work with government quite diplomatically. And like I said, that fine balance between effective advocacy and the really good critical friend, constructive friend of government approach is something that I think RenewableUK does extremely well. And a final one, perhaps, where we're holding the sector accountable is on sustainability and ESGs, just transition being one part of it. I mean, the sector asked us to put something on just transition that links to that people and skills and the transition from oil and gas challenge that COP is exploring on a daily basis since it started a few days ago. But there's also that sense that the sector has to be sustainable and has to adhere to the best and most ethical practices on ESGs more broadly, and that is both from a people perspective and from a this is the future perspective. And I can tell you a bit more, perhaps, if there's interest on our work on that area as well, because it's really important.
Well, absolutely. And what I would particularly like to sort of dive into with you is, tell me, is there a conflict ever between the commercial needs and the sustainability needs? And if there is a conflict, how does that get addressed and resolved?
Yeah. I mean, the conflict is usually from a kind of a bottom line perspective, isn't it? Because it's expensive to focus on sustainability. Sustainable Development Goals, ESGs as they're nowadays called, they're expensive. They require a commitment to, as I said, the best business ethics and the best business ethics in all areas of business operations, business processes, governance, and a company's approach to people and management and stakeholder management. So from a bottom line perspective, yes, there is a tension because you're investing funds in an area where you don't necessarily easily link to the financial benefits. That said, when ESGs were not even called ESGs, when I started to work on this 12 years ago, and I worked in Cambridge at Institute for Sustainability Leadership, in those days, companies were struggling to report on their commitment to sustainability, for example, and they were doing that more from the perspective of doing good than anything else. So there were lots of visionaries, and your Maslow pioneers, sitting there, just kind of having this dream, living in the donut. There were so many good considerations that came out in the very late 90s and the early noughties about why sustainability is important and why it's important for companies to focus on that. And most companies that were engaged in those works in those days were seeing this as an opportunity really to do something different and to have that sustainable capitalism as something different. Over time, perhaps because the cynics have, won part of the argument, is that this has become something more of a strategic imperative, not just from a bottom line perspective, but from a perspective of access to capital, access to investment, access to government funding, so different levels of capital, kind of the clear demonstration from various perspectives that companies are doing the right thing and that they are focusing on sustainable practices. So it just became more about risk management and access. Nowadays, for the sector in particular, it is really critical because we can't have publicity like the graveyard of blades and turbines sitting there causing concern on the public that we want to engage, the public that we want to get excited about green energy and make decisions on their personal and private lives. We can't have that kind of visual in front of us. So companies in the sector have to think about everything that they do, from their business practice and operations, the resources, the assets that they own, to the practices they have in terms of people, and see this as an opportunity. So it's an opportunity to then get access to investment and funding. It's an opportunity to get the public perception on our side, which basically extrapolated leads to a more profitable sector. It's the opportunity to get others to engage. And I think COP26 is really important in this. You can tell from my accent that I have a funny accent. I'm from Brazil originally. And in Brazil, I mean, obviously Brazil in a sense has been way ahead in some areas of renewable energy, not necessarily marine, offshore and onshore, but we've been committed to that for quite some time. But there is a cost. So for developing nations, there's a huge cost. I was listening to my CEO's interview with CNN yesterday, for example, South Africa, what a challenge, very heavily dependent on coal. You're not going to change this overnight, so companies need to see this as an opportunity in the long term. They have to remember that there is the opportunity of growing strategically, there is the opportunity of access to cash, there is the risk management, because otherwise people won't invest on them. So there's quite a lot of a broad spectrum there that makes sustainability critical. But the trick really is to embed the cost of sustainability when deploying, business plans going forward, and creating those additional revenue sources and seeing them as long-term sources. And remembering that, polluter pays principle, the cost of harm is actually quite high, and increasingly it will be high. So from the sector's perspective in the UK, I think, again, we're in a really good position because our market design is such that enables us to focus more on the sustainability of the energy and electricity generation in an easier way. But equally, companies are more accustomed here to have to tick these ESG boxes. They have been for 10 years, albeit perhaps for different reasons. Globally and internationally, remembering that many of our companies in our sector are international companies or cross-national companies or global companies with UK operations, the opportunity is again to work with governments and to work with civil society to highlight the need for that. If you ask people on the street, would you pay more for fair trade? Many will. You pay more for organic, many will. So it's about clarifying and being upfront about the fact that these costs are not high because the technology isn't there, or because X, Y, or Z isn't there. The costs are high because it costs to be ethical and to have those high standards. But that's what we should aspire to for this sector and, in terms of our economy more broadly, I should say.
You've mentioned several things there. You mentioned about being a critical friend. You've talked about challenges throughout the supply chain in raising the games of sustainability. How do you think RUK can actually work with the supply chain? What do you think RUK can do for the supply chain, and what does the supply chain need from RUK?
It's a great question, and it's a question that every board meeting, every board member, every senior team member in our organization asks, because it's a little bit like asking how long is a piece of string, because when we say supply chain, it's not necessarily clear what we mean. If I say a developer, I know exactly what that means. If I say supply chain, I might mean, what do I mean? Do I mean somebody working in ports? Do I mean somebody working a vessel? Do I mean somebody supporting a vessel with, for example, a particular piece of equipment for a vessel? Do I mean cables? Do I mean foundations? Do I mean the services supply chain, legal, financial, recruitment? So the supply chain is enormous. And in fact, the supply chain is about, in terms of numbers, is about 80% of our members these days. So they're very, very complex and diverse. So it's difficult for me to generalize. That said, I'm not going to avoid the question. What I will do is give you a bit of granularity. To some extent, some parts of the supply chain that are looking to generate business. So they're looking to be procured, they're looking to work with, as in tiers with those that are going to be hiring their services to deliver specific areas of services. Very often what they're after is networking, business development opportunities, which is why our events are so important. I do not in any way want to talk down commercial events. Commercial events are also important, but we believe that the trade body, the trade association events that are organized by the sector for the sector are really, really super important. We don't have as much of a commercial agenda as others. We do need to make a surplus to grow, but ultimately we're there to facilitate the right types of dialogue. And the supply chain, very often, that's what they want. They want more of those opportunities. They want opportunities to sell their wares, to showcase their work, and basically to get access. They're criticals very often of the developers and of those who are recruiting their work. They think that things are made too complicated, too bureaucratic. There's lack of transparency, which is why, for example, we're working with BASE and a number of other potential providers on establishing a kind of a tender portal, something that can make it easier for supply chain companies to feel that there is greater transparency in the process, and that it's not so time consuming and cumbersome that those that are smaller are just prevented from really entering the market because they just don't have the same resources as others, in spite of the fact that they might have something really cool. And equally, those that are strong and steady and that provide services and products in a in a sustained way, that they're not neglected completely because of the new shiny thing that has just come up. Because again, that's the other comment that we hear a lot from the supply chain members, is that the developers sometimes are just only interested in something that's really cool and shiny and new, and as a result, they're not engaging. Again, this is no criticism of the developers. This is just a perception. And again, what we do is obviously work with our colleagues. In that, we have a supply chain member forum, we have a supply chain working group at RenewableUK, both of which tackle that kind of relationship between the different types of members that we have. So the network and the business opportunity, the opportunities to grow are really important. We have for a long time struggled to identify what policy asks the supply chain needs. And when I say supply chain, again, that's why it's unhelpful to have it as a lumped category. When I talk about OEMs, they are part of the supply chain. OEMs have quite a different profile. And in terms of supporting the OEMs and the developers, for example, harmonize their interests when we have, auctions coming in and CFDs coming in, and in fact, developments in the sector that tie them to particular timelines, pricing structures, and others. We very often identify that what they need from us is really to just be very open and have the harmonization. So my CEO, myself, my deputy CEO, the whole senior team, we spend a lot of time talking one-to-one to people to then say, okay, this is what we understand, and now we need to bring this back without breaking any competition laws, of course, in the process, but just kind of bringing to the open the need to arrive at a consensus that isn't a compromise. I hate the word compromise because in my head immediately means that everybody's lost something. I don't like that. I just think getting to that collegial consensus is really important for a sector like ours, and I think we do really well. And I think the supply chain gets that from us. So that's a second thing that I think that supply chain gets and needs. A final thing, which is also something that we've been trying to understand and we haven't got right yet, is what policy asks does the wider supply chain. So let's say if I were to segment ports, vessels, manufacturing areas, cables, and then services, what do they need from us? It's clear that in some cases they need investment. So recent announcements on investments on ports and floating, for example, is just super exciting because that's exactly the kind of thing that we need to be doing and that we are doing. But what more do they need? We started with a premise last year when my colleague Melon, the deputy CEO, joined and launched the member forum, is that there are things that the supply chain needs that we're not getting from a policy perspective. But what we ended up identifying is that the supply chain does not want us to be calling for too much policy. We're not a regulator. We're not here to constrain. And perhaps in trying to do good, we might be doing harm. So fewer of those more directive policy areas is what is asked of us. But what we're asked to do, and that's what the supply chain working group is working on, is the commerciality, the commercialization, the competitiveness of the supply chain externally. So in the UK, but also abroad in terms of exports. That's really important. My director of business development, Vicky Mant, who works to me, she also works very much with the Business Network of Offshore Wind in America. So again, how do you get the supply chain to export to America, to export through RUK, our partners in COP, to Asia and to Europe? And how do you keep the supply chain consistently competitive and very commercial? A final one that the working group is working on, as I said, is about portals, is about procurement practices, it's about transparency. And that seems to be all that what they're after from a trade body. Although, like I said, we're constantly trying to find out more and what more we can do, because the supply chain membership to RUK is why we say we are credible. We couldn't be credible as a trade body for renewable energy without the supply chain behind us. We're not a developers club. We are here to service the whole sector. The whole sector is the supply chain of the delivery of renewable energy anyways. So this is particularly important to us, and we'll continue to work on identifying more of that.
Fantastic, and that's a fantastic place to leave it.
Energy. Marine. Energy. Power. Widesight TV.